Good evening. I'd like to open this meeting and welcome everyone to the ordinary meeting of Council of the 28th of November 2017. Moonee Valley Council respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of this land of the Kulin Nation of the Wurundjeri people and pay our respects to their elders past and present and their spirits. Council also extends their respect to the elders, descendants and of other Aboriginal people here today. I advise members of the public here tonight that open sessions of this meeting are held and recorded live and streamed on the internet. Gallery attendees, you are advised that your presence may also be recorded over the course of this meeting. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to our online audience as well, who are watching on Facebook and live streaming and the website. A recording of this meeting will also be archived and later made available on Council website. Councillors, do I have an apology? I don't believe we have any apologies here tonight because we're all present. So I'll go to item number 3, confirmation of minutes. Councillors, do I have a mover and a seconder for the confirmation of minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday the 14th of November 2017? Councillor Lawrence, thank you. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Nation, thank you. Would you like to speak to that, Councillor Lawrence? I'll take that straight to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Item number 4, declaration of councillors. Does any councillor have any conflict of interest in any of the items on tonight's agenda? We don't have any. Councillors, do we have any presentations this evening? No? Petitions and joint letters. Councillors, any petitions and joint letters? No? This is looking good. Questions from the public. Mr Lancaster, do we have any questions from the public?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. There are no questions from the public. Mr Mayor, sorry. Apologies, Mr Mayor. We do not have any questions of the public tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Lancaster. Sorry. We'll go to the next item, reports by Mayor and Councillors. Councillors, do I have a mover and a seconder that the reports by Councillors and the Mayor be received? Councillor Sorais. Councillor Marshall. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Just also to advise that I have submitted a report separate to this with the delegation to Lead West that took place in August, September. Thank you.
Okay. Councillors, would anybody else like to speak on the item? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Next report on tonight's agenda is Council Report 9.1 on tonight's agenda, and it relates to a planning application at 72 Ascot Vale Road, Flemington. Councillors, do I have a mover? Councillor Marshall.
Yes, Mayor. The motion I would like to move is as follows. That Council issue a notice of decision to refuse to grant a permit in relation to planning permit application number MB2 2017 for the construction of 2 multi-storey buildings comprising dwellings in a general residential zone, partial demolition and construction of buildings and works in a heritage overlay, HO 426, reduction in car parking requirements and alteration of access to a road in a row zone, Category 1 at number 72 Ascot Vale Road, Flemington, Lot 1 TP 119244V in accordance with the following grounds of refusal. 1. The proposed building height, scale and massing fails to meet the overarching objective and the strategies of Clause 15012 Urban Design Principles of the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme and would result in an urban design outcome that fails to positively contribute to the local character and enhance the public realm. 2. The proposed building height, scale and massing fails to meet the objectives and strategies of Clause 21061 Neighbourhood Character and Clause 21064 Urban Design, as it does not respect or contribute to the preferred character of the urban contemporary 3 precinct and fails to appropriately respond to its location and surrounding context. 3. The development would present a visually dominant and unsympathetic built form character to the area and will have an adverse effect on the residential amenity of neighbouring land. 4. The development would result in adverse overlooking and privacy impacts on the residential amenity of neighbouring land. 5. The proposed vehicle access ways do not provide for safe or efficient vehicular movements, which will result in adverse safety and streetscape impacts. 6. The proposal will exacerbate existing car parking issues and cause adverse traffic impacts on the surrounding area, which will be substantial and unreasonable.
Thank you, Councillor Marshall. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Cusack. Councillor Marshall, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, and apologies that was rather long, but it's probably quite telling, the length of those grounds of refusal. I think it is fair to say that some planning applications which come before us are very easy to decide, and some are very difficult, and I think that this falls into the very easy category. What we have here is a proposal for 2 6-storey buildings on Ascot Vale Road, and with 159 dwellings proposed. Now, at the outset, I have to acknowledge that this is a very large site, and obviously one of the interfaces is with the railway line, so I certainly acknowledge that. But we must keep in mind that this is residentially zoned land, and a stroke of good fortune in a sense for the applicant is that they managed to lodge this permit application before the changes to the GRZ, which came in at the state level, because if it had have been after that, we would not be considering this, because they would be limited to 3 storeys. But in any event, it's really important that we keep in mind that this is residentially zoned land, and with that come constraints and limitations. I think anyone who knows this area will very much know that we have other quite lovely residential properties on Ascot Vale Road, and we certainly have very significant, beautiful properties in Crown Street, which is on the other side. From a design perspective, there are lots of things wrong with this application, and certainly when you look at the car parking, the access points, you are having very large sections of the streetscape taken up by those access points. And for me too, one of the real concerns about having an access point from Crown Street, if anyone knows this pocket well, it's a bit of an oasis in Flemington in some ways. Like, there's a real quietness about it around Illawarra, around Crown Street, and the idea that we would allow hundreds of cars, if you look at the number of trips that would be generated, to be spewing onto this quiet little pocket is just, it's totally unreasonable to me and not something I can support in any way. Now, obviously, the 6 storeys, it's just simply too high, that proposal, and the visual impacts and the amenity impacts associated with that height are unreasonable, and they are totally unsupportable. Part of it is that they just don't add to the neighbourhood character of the area, and I know officers have suggested in their recommendation that we delete 1 level, but to my mind that is not in any way sufficient enough to mitigate the impacts of the very large bulk that it will still be there if we have a 5-storey development along here. And so even to my mind, at 5 it is too high, it's too bulky, and has all the visual impacts associated with that, and certainly totally out of character with the surrounding properties, which, I mean, it's one thing to sort of look forward and look down the road, but it's important to keep in mind what is in the immediate surrounding area, and not just out onto the Ascot Vale Road aspect. And I think what has been forgotten is that sitting behind this site, as I said, is what is a low scale in terms of height neighbourhood. And I think too, although it's low scale, the reality is that so many of the properties in Flemington, they're quite small just by their nature and by virtue of the way that that particular area was subdivided. And that's why when we're looking at amenity impacts, and particularly any potential amenity impacts on backyards, we need to treat them incredibly seriously, because the properties here have limited space as it is, so anything that detrimentally affects that needs to be treated with significant concern. I'm mindful of the time, and Mayor, I might need a short extension, but I will try and be as quick as I can. I might perhaps leave it to another councillor to talk about some of the proposed traffic conditions. Certainly, I can't remember a time where I've seen so many conditions proposed by the officers, a way of addressing what might be some concerns around the proposed traffic movements, and that for me is a big red flag. There's reference to a 1.7 metre high steel blade screens proposed at the ground floor terraces along Ascot Vale Road, and that is pretty much as hideous as it sounds, and The report also talks about the proximity to Ascot Vale. The hostile Ascot Vale Road streetscape was the terminology used, and I think the idea that we would add to the hostility is mostly about the traffic, and it's mostly about some perhaps buildings further down that have not enhanced the neighbourhood at all. But for me, there is lots of beauty around there, and that is the thing that we should be promoting. Not the hostility, if you like. Just briefly, the preferred character statement for the precinct talks about new developments to complement the existing siding materials with low garden settings, the use of lighter finishes with pitched rooftops, and low or permeable front fences, which will provide views to the dwellings. And how anyone can say this particular application is in fitting with the preferred character statement is really quite beyond me. Other than perhaps the views to the dwellings, because given this would be 6 stories, it would be impossible to miss. The parking, there's a requirement for 196 and it provides 177. And much is made in the report about the proximity to public transport. And I can tell you, as I'm sure any people sitting here in the gallery who live close, it's a fair old hike to Newmarket Station from this site. It's not, we're not talking about something that's directly across the road from Newmarket. And while as much as I love the 57 tram, it's fair to say that it's not the world's greatest people mover. So the suggestion that visitors to this site would rely on either going to Newmarket and walking across or catching the 57, to me, is not one that I can give any credibility to. And again, I think it's fair to say that any resident living in and around this area probably wishes they had $1 for every time they've had a parking issue or tried to deal with a parking issue. And as a councillor, I wish I had $1 for every time I try to help residents resolve the parking issues in and around this area. And if we had those dollars and we combine them together, we would be able to purchase this site and actually put a development that enhanced the neighbourhood rather than sought to destroy it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cusack.
Thank you, Councillor Marshall, for such a comprehensive rundown on this. So I'm obviously going to echo for your sentiments in this debate. The issues that popped into my mind that are critical and trying to add and elaborate, I suppose, a little bit more on what you say, is that first of all, this is a development within the residential zone that is of a significant height. And as you say, and as we read, the officers have suggested that the development could, in fact, come down one level. Now, if that's the suggestion there, I understand, and the way I read it is that coming down one level doesn't detract from the actual overall proposal in the officer's mind. It's just something that can be done. Well, frankly, this is not an area that should be subjected to 5 levels on the basis of there are monstrous buildings down the other end of the road. And 1 Ascot Vale Road is a blot on the landscape, and unfortunately for any report that continually reference the high-rise in Crown Street as also another reason for going so high is just an absolute mistake. That was used as a reference to get 1 Ascot Vale up, and it is now, and as I said at the time, that this is now repeating that same issue over and over, and using that as a template is just totally wrong. We need to have another template to look at our suburb. What is critical to me in this proposal and why I'm opposing it is that the relevance of the whole building is not just to Ascot Vale Road. It's very much to the Newmarket area and the community in that area that is going to be affected by it. Councillor Marshall made reference to the traffic flows and so on like that. And yes, there are a lot of issues in and around there. But I mean, and we know that there's going to be a significant movement of traffic on very small roads that are very, very neighbourhood-like, where clearly we'll be into all sorts of shuffles just to be able to accommodate a large number of new cars. But my question is also, how do they actually get in there? Racecourse Road, not all that many moons ago, where the tram lines go up and are involved, had blockages put on them so that people can't turn right or left and do things like that into Crown Street. You've got Edinburgh Street, which is also a critical entrance point into this, but we all know how busy Ascot Vale Road is. What's the likelihood of that staying as it is and not ultimately impacting on this community? I haven't touched on all of the other issues, and can I just have another little bit?
Sure.
Time. I don't want to go into too much, but there is a critical issue about open space involved here. We have a large number of new people being proposed as residents, and the only open space in the area is the Crown Street stables area. It seems to me that this is just sort of packing people in without common sense to how people live and what the amenity of an area and its neighbourhood feels like. I also am very concerned about the fact that there is mention in this proposal, reasons to go ahead with this development in the officer's report, of its proximity to the structure plan, which we put a stop to and that we discontinued. And it's not in the structure plan area, it's near it. So how can you go for 5 stories in something that was never even envisaged to be 5 stories? I also worry about sort of that common sense. And it says in the document itself, in that neighbourhood, the predominant height is 1 to 4. So it sinks on its own debate. I think that the 33 people who objected to this development were quite right to do so. I believe that there are many, many more people who agree with their sentiments, and I, for one, think that they're on the right track, and we should be we should be supporting this motion and not supporting the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Nation.
Thank you, Mayor. I am speaking in support of this refusal and concur with my fellow ward councillors that this particular application is not appropriate for this site. I do so conceding that, as Councillors Marshall and Cusack have noted, it is a large site. It measures 100 by 50 metres, but it is a significant increase in density on a site which is single stories. And if you look at that eastern strip of Ascot Vale Road, everything from Dover, north of the train line, down to Racecourse Road is all single stories except the block of flats on the corner of Edinburgh Street, and they are 2 stories fronting onto Ascot Vale Road and then 3 stories on the main interface on Edinburgh Street. But everything else along that strip is single story, and there's some quite old properties. There's that lovely bluestone building, but immediately south of this particular site there is 4 single-storey old terraces, which probably stretch back a few generations. And that particular strip has, given what has gone on in Ascot Vale Road, it's got a remarkable intactness of heritage. And I think this report draws on what is on the western side of Ascot Vale Road, but when you actually look at the site in context to what's on the eastern side, then even 3 or 4 stories is, in my mind, not appropriate, let alone 6. And it is a 6-storey application, which our officers have conditioned to be 5. And in the report, the wording is, it notes the lower scale residential nature of the site and surrounding areas, which I concur with, along with the need to respect existing and preferred neighbourhood character, and that taking this into account ultimately results in a recommendation to reduce the application from 6 stories to 5. So if you think about that comment in the report, to respect existing and preferred neighbourhood character, then on that eastern side of Ascot Vale Road, this application does not do that as 6 stories. It still doesn't do it as 5 stories. As Councillor Cusack said, 6 to 5, much of a muchness for anyone who lives in that strip or back out onto Crown Street, or even further down Edinburgh. It is going to be something that impacts their way of life. And that's just visually, let alone the traffic implications that my fellow ward councillors have raised. This particular site, to where, and taking into consideration the Crown Street interface as well, which I haven't even commented on, this particular site is not appropriate for large-scale development, particularly not 6 or 5 stories. I don't think it is, and just note a small extension of time, I don't think it is our responsibility or our planning department's responsibility to have to condition an application to match the preferred neighbourhood character. I still argue that it doesn't. And I hope fellow councillors will share this view. Don't consider what is on that western side of Ascot Vale Road. Consider the traffic implications of it, but visually and in terms of the intactness of the housing stock right along that eastern side, I ask that my fellow councillors please acknowledge that this is a sensitive interface to a very old heritage area, and that we need to do everything we can to maintain that precinct's integrity, and not approve something which would be so vastly different to all of the housing stock, even the high-rise flats, all of the housing stock in that pocket of Flemington.
Thank you, Councillor. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Sorais.
Thank you, Mayor. Just, I'm speaking in support of the motion that's been moved by Councillor Marshall. We as a council have the authority to make these decisions on behalf of our community. That's what we're elected to do. And we do this because we live in the municipality and we see, as we've heard from our fellow councillors in the Moonee ward, how this proposed development could affect the livability of the people in that neighbourhood. So I take on board the comments that have been made. I support the comments that have been made, and I think that I thank Councillor Marshall for putting forward this notice of motion for a refusal. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other councillor? Councillor Marshall, would you like to close?
One of the things we're required to do when we make these decisions is to look at the particular site in context, and I think unfortunately in this instance there has been a larger weight given to the further down the road, down Ascot Vale Road, than what there should have been, with a lesser consideration given to the surrounding low density and low scale properties. We can't ignore what is around there, and certainly there are a number of properties both on Ascot Vale Road but very much in the precinct sitting behind this site that have been identified as having potential heritage significance in the Heritage Gap study. And we must also keep in mind that we should not do anything which could potentially damage or hinder our ability to look at those potential heritage controls, and I think something like this certainly would have the potential to do that. So I'd ask that councillors, in light of all of the issues that have been raised, that they support this motion to refuse the application, and that hopefully if this does end up going to the tribunal, that the tribunal will get out there and actually have a look at this site and see what would be appropriate.
Thank you, Councillor Marshall. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Councillors, next item is 9.2 on tonight's agenda and is on page 46 and relates to a planning application at 74 to 76 Woodland Street, Strathmore. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I would like to put forward an alternative motion.
Thank you. Do I have a second? Councillor Goughie. Councillor Sharp.
Yes.
Thank you.
That Council, with respect to an application for review against Council's failure to decide the application within the prescribed time, resolves to advise the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal and other parties to the application that if Council were in a position to decide on the application, the decision would have been to issue a notice of decision to refuse to grant a permit in relation to planning permit application number MB 1772017 for the construction of 10 dwellings, a reduction in car parking requirements and an alteration of access to a road in a road zone category 1 at number 74 to 76 Woodland Street, Strathmore. lots 22, 23, 24, 25, LP 9480 and lot 1 TP 814690U in accordance with the following grounds of refusal. The proposal fails to meet the overarching objective and strategies of clause 15.01-5 cultural identity and neighbourhood character of Moonee Valley Planning Scheme and would result in a development that fails to appropriately respond and contribute to the neighbourhood character. Point 2, the visual bulk, scale, form and layout of the proposal fails to meet the objectives and strategies of clause 21.06-1 neighbourhood character and clause 21.06-4 urban design, as it does not respect or contribute to the preferred character of the Garden Suburban 6 precinct and fails to appropriately respond to its location and surrounding context. Point 3, the proposal fails to satisfy the following standards contained within clause 55, 2 or more dwellings on a lot of the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme and does not achieve an acceptable outcome in terms of the following objectives. A, clause 55.02-1 neighbourhood character. B, clause 55.02-2 residential policy. C, clause 55.02-5 integration with the street. D, clause 55.03-1 street setback. E, clause 55.03-2 building height. F, clause 55.03-3 site coverage. G, 55.03-8 landscaping. H, clause 55.04-1 side and rear setbacks. I, clause 55.04-2 walls on boundaries. J, clause 55.04-6 overlooking. K, clause 55.04-8 noise impacts. L, clause 55.05-5 solar access to open space. M, clause 55.06-1 design detail. N, clause 55.06-2 front fences. And O, clause 55.06-4 site services. And point 4, the proposal will have an adverse effect on the residential amenity of neighbouring land.
Thank you, Councillor Sharp. Councillor Goucher, do we still have you as a seconder? Okay. Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's been a while since I've had to read out a refusal with so many non-compliance issues detailed there in point 3. So in saying that, when I do see the number of non-compliance matters that are indicated there, obviously red flags go up and I'm always very, very cautious. But basically this development sits on both a residential zone and commercial zone. The residential zone is a larger part of the lot. We had quite a number, all the ward councillors were at the consultation meeting, and we had quite a number of residents come and chat to us, and the applicant was there as well. Nothing was decided on at the meeting in regards to getting a better outcome, but I guess the crux of this refusal for me is that the fact that we have the residential and the commercial zone abutting each other, but this proposal seeks to combine them effectively. And I've always felt that zones are definitely there for a reason, and effectively this development blurs the lines that the zones are there to impose and seeks to increase density within the residential zone quite significantly. Our planning controls clearly state that residential character and neighbourhood character should be considered and respected. This proposal, I believe, unfortunately doesn't respect this aspect. I note that it is mentioned in the report that 3-storey buildings have been built close by, but when you do go down and have a look around this site, the 3-storey buildings or dwellings are within the commercial zone. There's no 3-storey dwellings or buildings within the residential zone. I do understand that the site is close to Strathmore train station. However, the crux of the issue is that effectively through this application, the higher density commercial zone is being extended into the residential zone. The development backs onto one of the most prestigious streets in Strathmore, Rosebank Avenue, where there are no 3-storey dwellings. And I must state that residents within this little pocket of Strathmore and within the broader area around there, they can understand development and they've seen, developments happen. But I can safely say that they would not have expected to fight such, or be in the position to have to fight against such a higher density development within the location that it's currently proposed to be in. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Goucher.
I think Councillor Sharp has spoken fairly comprehensively, and the refusal itself is extensive for a reason. In terms of the obvious things around boundaries and height and setbacks, they're not compliant, and that's part of this. But the real picture for us is about the character of this neighbourhood. The opposite side of the road is commercial, there are shops, and we understand that there will be a level of height and development on the commercial side. If you walk down to the end of the street towards the station, it's commercial, and we understand there'll be a level of density and a level of height there. But in effect, in buying this property, they've bought the one next door that is a tiny, tiny little sliver of land in order to try and make the bigger parcel commercial, and that's the key problem here for us. If the scale of townhouses reflected the neighbourhood character and reflected the little village that it's in, then it would be less of an issue. But in trying to put that many townhouses on that block in that spot is a problem. It just tries to creep into the residential area. The fact there were 78 objectors speaks volumes about how inappropriate it is for the area. So thank you.
Councillor Goucher. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I support this refusal motion for this development, and for several important reasons. And one in particular is that Strathmore people absolutely love their suburb, and they're not prepared to lie down and just have it overtaken by overdevelopment and destroying a neighbourhood character that they particularly love. The 10 by triple storey buildings, in my opinion, don't blend in with the local neighbourhood character. As the report rightly points out, and I quote, "A number of quantitative built form standards within the Res Code have not been met by the proposed development," unquote. The number of conditions, and I think I'm repeating what my fellow ward councillors have mentioned, have the number of conditions that the report alludes to obviously indicates, in my opinion, that the design of this development is inadequate, and that it fails to meet the fundamental development requirements in this area. And it also, as set out, it fails to meet the Moonee Valley planning scheme, in my opinion. These conditions, as set out, and I won't go through them all, but just a few of them that come to mind: the setback issues, the overlooking neighbourhood issues, front fence issues, noise attenuation issues, location of waste bins, finishes of external materials. The list goes on, and I won't go through them all because it will only make one realise how inadequate it is. The overall site coverage of 66.7% is excessive to a site that is surrounded by residential zoned land, and the site coverage and the sheer visual bulk of this development in that area and the massing of the buildings is an issue that the streetscape and the sensitive residential interface towards the rear of the site, as Councillor Sharp alluded to, and again I quote from the report, "do not respect the existing or preferred neighbourhood character of this area," unquote. Now I also want to just allude to probably another issue which isn't directly in front of this building, but it is in the area, and that is the North Park mansion that exists just up the hill from on the other side of the road, and it was built by Alexander McCracken back in 1888. And this is considered to be one of the best examples of Federation Queen Anne style in Melbourne. And to go destroying this area, and if we start creeping up Woodland Street, well, it's just going to keep going up there. And if we have a building like that surrounded by modern architecture and so forth, then we're just going to really have some issues on our hands in terms of how we treat historical mansions, and it's probably one of 4 or 5 within the city of Moonee Valley that we just have to be very mindful of what goes around it. Car parking is another great issue that comes to mind.
Extension, Councillor?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I'll be brief. And meeting the requirements of 2-bedroom apartments, I know is only a 1-car requirement in terms of the code, However, as we all know, two-bedroom apartments, we nearly always end up with 2 cars per apartment. Where are they going to park? Well, you don't have to be Einstein to figure that out. They're going to be out in the street, they're going to be in the side streets, and we're going to have a surrounding area that's just full of parked cars. And then, of course, the congestion that goes with that in terms of traffic. Finally, the height of the development does not provide an appropriate transition from the built form along the Woodland Street streetscape and the adjoining properties, and as such will only diminish the neighbourhood character. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Would any other Councillor Nation?
Thank you, Mayor. I don't rise. I stay seated to support Councillor Sharp's refusal. And I think, in particular, as Councillor Lawrence and Sharp have both explained, the number of conditions that have been placed on this application just to make it somewhat compliant with our planning scheme is quite staggering. When I assess an application, I often go to the site coverage and then look at the height and then look at the setbacks and then work through, as Councillor Lawrence said, those more quantitative numbers and then look at the more subjective elements like heritage and neighbourhood character. And that wad of, how many was the Councillor Sharp? It was about 15 or 16 non-compliances with our planning scheme is so substantial that I'm a little bit surprised it's even come to us to decide as a council. I think for a council, we're the planning authority. We are not responsible for conditioning every flaw with the proposal to make it somewhat compliant with our planning scheme. And in essence, that is what this application is. I can't really recall an application of a similar sort of size that we've had before us in recent time that has had to be so heavily conditioned just to make it and it's somewhat compliant, because even with all the conditions, there's still some areas of non-compliance. I definitely don't think it's appropriate for the site. Our planning scheme says it's not appropriate for the site. Our planning scheme says it's a flawed application. And I'd like to think that hopefully the tribunal member at VCAT shares a similar view to the ward councillors that have spoken. And sorry, Councillor Couch-Marici, to the ward councillors that have spoken, and the consensus among objectors that this is definitely a flawed application, and it is in no way suitable for Woodland Street or anywhere where the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme is enforced throughout a municipality.
Thank you, Councillor Nation. Any other Councillor Bird?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be supporting the refusal as well. I'll touch on what Councillor Lawrence mentioned before, and that was in relation to the car parking. So, although it's compliant in terms of 1 car spot for every house which has 2 bedrooms, there are no visitor car parks. So, if anyone realistically thinks that with 10 units there's going to be no visitors at any one time, I think that's a little bit absurd. But the other concern that I also have is that in dwellings 1, 5, 6 and 10, there appears to be a big game room down the bottom, and I do realise that it is conditioned that it doesn't turn into a 3rd bedroom, because of course if it did have that 3rd bedroom, all of a sudden you would need an extra car spot for those 4 dwellings, and that obviously just couldn't fit into the plans, therefore it's as a games room. So I'm quite concerned about a application like this going in on Woodland Street. I don't think that it's appropriate, and I'm glad Councillor Sharp has put up this refusal. Thank you.
Councillor. Any other Councillor? Councillor Marshall.
Just very briefly to speak in support of the motion, because obviously there's been significant coverage of these issues of concern. To me, this almost feels like a bit of an attempt at a planning scheme amendment by stealth, and the purchase of the sites with 2 different zonings. I can certainly understand why an applicant may have done it, but it does concern me that there has been almost an attempt to try and say, well, you know what, look at this site, this is really mixed use and to get around all of the things that go along, again, as I spoke about earlier, with having residential land and all of the important controls around amenity, things designed to protect the amenity that come with Res Code. And it is there for a reason, and as I've said before, we need to be guardians of residential amenity in Moonee Valley, and this is very much an application that has little regard for the surrounding area and certainly does not reflect what is really quite a special and beautiful street in Moonee Valley.
Thank you. Any other councillor? Councillor Sharp would like to close.
Thank you. Thank you for the councillors who have spoken tonight in support of my alternative for refusal. It is very disheartening to see so many areas of non-compliance on an application like this. Effectively, the proposal is just completely out of character with the neighbourhood. And as I certainly concur with many councillors who have stated that it could potentially set a precedence and move further up the street if we allow something like this to go forward. As a council, I do believe that we really need to have a strong stance against these type of applications that appear to just blatantly disregard our planning scheme and just blatantly disregard our neighbourhood character. The neighbourhood character controls are set in our planning scheme and they really need to be complied with to ensure that we are seeing developments occur in our city that are based on our guidelines, which have been consulted with by the community over however many years. So, yes. Just thank you for the councillors that have spoken, and I hope that my refusal is upheld tonight. Thank you.
Councillors, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. 9.3 on tonight's agenda is on page 84 and relates to a planning application at 84 to 86 Walter Street, Ascot Vale. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillors, I need a motion for Walter Street. Councillor Sharp. Move the officer's recommendation. Councillors, do I have a seconder? Need a seconder, councillors? Councillor Nation. Councillor Sharp, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. Just getting the report up. I understand the application here for 84 to 86 Walter Street is on quite a large block, and it's proposed to have 8 four-bedroom dwellings. This was, I think Councillor Marshall mentioned earlier, some applications are harder and some applications are easier to decide on. This application is certainly on the harder end of the spectrum, but in saying that, given its location and its proximity to some other more intense, I guess is the word, developments within that local area, not higher density, but just the number of dwellings on the block. I'm happy to support the officer's recommendations based on the conditions that are contained within this recommendation. I'll wait to hear what other councillors say. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Nation.
Thank you, Mayor. Given we've sat here for 2 items discussing the flaws of both of those applications, we then get an application like this at 84 to 86 Walter Street, where at least the applicant has presented a proposal that ticks the majority of boxes, most of the boxes in our planning scheme. And while I could sit here and argue that density should not be supported, I do think the application is somewhat tame as to what could be developed on the site. It's a 1,500 square metre block on which less than half, specifically 47%, will be built on. Our planning scheme allows up to 60% site coverage, so this application is well below what could be allowed on this site. It provides more than the number of car spaces required. It taps into the idea of housing diversity by proposing 8 4-bedroom dwellings rather than just the stock standard 1 or 2 bedders, which are fairly rife in planning applications on sites of this size. The two parts of the planning scheme where the application isn't compliant, one is the front setbacks, and they are in line with what else is the other housing stock on Walter Street in immediate proximity to this application. And there is an issue with a window which is located close to an access way. But when you look at how this application stacks up against our planning scheme and res code, it is extremely compliant. On neighbourhood character, which, as I said in the last report, it's somewhat of a subjective clause. It may not be overly similar to the housing stock on Walter Street, particularly north of Walter Street Reserve, but it does back onto the enclave estate and is somewhat similar, if not somewhat less dense than the housing stock within that estate. I thoroughly understand the concerns of residents who would prefer the site to stay as it is. We all would, but when assessing an application, as I've done on the previous two and we've done on the previous two tonight, you need to view the merits and the flaws of that application. And on what is presented to us, it would be a bit of a struggle, I think, to rationally support a refusal for this application. I could make a very emotive argument to do so, because obviously we want everything to stay as it is. We don't like change, we don't like overdevelopment, but we are here to make rational and sensible decisions, and given how we assess these applications, particularly given the so many flaws we've pointed out on other applications, I would not want to sit here and give false hope to residents that this could go to VCAT and have much of a chance to be defeated or upheld, a refusal to be upheld at VCAT based on a couple of elements of standards in our planning scheme which it doesn't adhere to. Doing so, as I said, would give residents false hope. So may I just have a little extension? I think it would give residents false hope. I think it may waste council's time and money. And in a way, and I'm sure other councillors may argue differently, but it in a way is defending what would be the somewhat indefensible. I know that is not going to sit well with those who have objected, and I appreciate that people who have objected are going to be impacted by development happening on this site, as opposed to it staying the same. But it is better than what could be on the site, and a 47% site coverage is a lot better than a developer milking it right up to that 60%, or as per other applications tonight, being above 70%. And that's the honest truth. We're sat here criticising applications that don't meet our planning scheme. So when we get one that adheres to pretty much everything in the planning scheme, I don't think it is appropriate just to refuse it because. We're here to make informed, rational decisions, and on that basis, completely taking into consideration the views of the objectors, I can't rationally sit here and refuse this application based on what's presented to us.
Thank you, Councillor Nation. Would any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Thrace.
Thank you. I won't be supporting the motion, and my reasons are being that we're looking at, whilst there might be some compliance, I don't believe that this application fits in with Council's policy on neighbourhood character or street side backs. We're looking at 5 double stories and 3 triple story dwellings on what, from I can see in our papers, is predominantly a single story development area. We have the opportunity, as I said earlier on a previous application, to make these decisions on behalf of the people that we represent who live in these areas. And the feedback of what we've had from people in these areas is that this is going to impact the safety and the amenity of the area in which they live. Without a doubt, there's going to be increased traffic. Without a doubt, there is going to be a visual impact and the scale of a property where we've got 5 double stories and 3 triple story dwellings. I think that is an important factor to be considered here. Whilst most of the other issues, as we've got in our report, seem to comply, I don't believe that according to our neighbourhood character or our street setback that they do. So I will not be supporting the recommendation as moved.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marshall.
Look, this is a large site for Ascot Vale. This is 1,516 square metres. And there are a few things about the way that this has been designed which are quite pleasing, and certainly having the 2 dwellings from the front really does maintain the streetscape. So my concerns around this development are not related to that, because I think that that's been done quite well. The way that they have proposed the car parking, and again, as National Councillor Sharp mentioned, this does actually well and truly meet the car parking requirements in that regard. It's been done in a way that I think that it's done well. And again, certainly I know that there are parking concerns around this area, and that no one who lives within these dwellings, were they to be approved and be built, would be entitled to parking permits, which is important because obviously it's within council's remit to change restrictions, and that is something certainly within our control. I do very much acknowledge the precinct-wide traffic issues. And I know, had confirmed today, that the LATAM to deal with this area is not proposed for another couple of years, and I query whether we can actually wait that long. As we all know, that the development at the Ascot Chase, the enclave, has been significant, and that there will be further development at Newsom Street. There are enormous numbers of people living in and around here now, and we are going to need to think very carefully and very clearly and very quickly, in my view, around how traffic moves around the area. So I certainly think that that is something that we will need to be considering. My significant concerns are in relation to the aspect of the development that really has significant bulk and potential amenity impacts on the neighbouring property. I think that they are significant, and again, from a design perspective, I wish that there could have perhaps been one less dwelling or some additional thought given to how that interface might occur. So for me, that is it's a significant concern, and it's why as much as I certainly do acknowledge the points around the level of compliance that this particular application has, and the streetscape one's an interesting, the setback from the street setback is an interesting one, because there are mixed setbacks along Walter Street. So I think that would be one that would be unlikely to be successful at the tribunal. But as I said, for me, there's a design aspect to this in terms of the bulk. Sorry, I'm almost finished, so I won't even bother asking. And that interface with the neighbouring properties really causes me significant concern.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other? Councillor Cusack.
I'm not supporting this motion, but I suppose I'm coming at it a little bit from where Councillor Marshall came from, in that there are many aspects of this development that do stack up and get a tick within our planning scheme. The concerns that I have are dwellings 3, 5 and 7, they're joined up and they become one very long part of the development, and that scale and massing against that neighbour's property is a worry to me. And even though this whole development has it's like a square within a square, we have substantial landscaping around the outer fringe and good setbacks, whatever, like that. Then we have this building square in the middle, and that worries me, the way that has been put together. It strikes me that there is a design issue here that running right down the spine of this development is the garaging and the way cars move, and that there is no break in that either. And so while there is good landscaping, while there is good good site coverage, it's pushed out to the edges. Now, this doesn't create any notional real capacity for any communal connectivity or anything like that, because everybody's looking out to where the green is, and when you go towards the centre of the development, you kind of get in your car and nick off. And yes, there's pedestrian walk-through, but however, I mean, I also acknowledge, and I'd be churlish if I didn't, the efforts that have been made to do the double-fronted, to get the pitch roofs, to get the colour palette pretty right, and a number of those things. But it just doesn't sit well with me. Now, I understand why buildings 3, 5 and 7 are there, and they're bunched up, because that's so that you can get the driveway in, so that you can get the cars off the road, so that you can get into this centre place and put everybody into their their double garages. And it seems if there was one, and I agree with Councillor Marshall, if there was one less in this, so that you could get something of a similar break with the even-numbered developments, which have a split in the middle of them, so that there isn't this long substantial wall, you would and try to get some sort of similar break for the even-numbered, for the odd-numbered ones of 3, 5 and 7, we might have been in a really good place here. So I can't support the development on the basis that I look to the future. I think that whether the building will stack up always as a really good site, and even though it's got 4 bedrooms per place, and I love that notion, is this going to necessarily work as a place for families when you've got so much of the area covered in that space? So there you are.
Any other councillor? Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. There's no perfect development that I can think of, but this, to me, provides not perfection, but it aims to alleviate the issues that maybe the other ones that we've looked at tonight have addressed. And from that perspective, and the fact that and Councillor Cusack mentioned this, these are 4-bedroom developments for families. They're not developments for couples or even single people, and there aren't a lot of those around. Most developments that we generally see are for single or 2-bedroom apartments, and this to me says, hey, we're providing a quality development for families in the Ascot Vale area. So I suggest that it's something that's different. It doesn't cause too much headache for the planning scheme, and I think that's a good thing. There aren't a truckload of conditions being thrown at it, so I would support this. Thank you.
Any other councillor? Councillor Thrace.
I'd just like to point out, I know I've spoken to this, but on page 94, 2.5, the consultation meeting, it's listed that I was a councillor that attended the deputation with the objectors and council's planning officer. Well, I wasn't. I was actually overseas at the time. So just an amendment in the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any other councillor like to speak? Councillor Sharp would like to close. Oh, Councillor Burt.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be quick on this. I look at the planning scheme, and I know that there's some, it's really easy to think with your heart sometimes, but as Councillor Nation has pointed out, if this goes to VCAT, I don't think we're going to get anything, much better than what we have here. It is extremely compliant. At the end of the day, we're the responsible authority, and it is extremely compliant. We're looking at only 47% site coverage with 35% permeability. They've given an extra car spot, which, as we've heard from previous applications, is unheard of pretty much with our applications. And I do take on board what Councillor Marshall and Councillor Cusack have said in terms of having the 3 dwellings side by side. However, when I think about it, if that was just one long dwelling, people would probably be okay. I think it's just the thought that it's going to be 3, which is of concern. It's a hard one because we don't like overdevelopment, and I completely understand the traffic issues. But in terms of what the applicant has put forward here, it's very compliant, and I think it's probably the best we're going to get for a block of land that at the end of the day is 16 square metres. It's huge. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other councillor? Councillor Gauci? No? Councillor Sharp, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. I think all councillors that have spoken have described what we have in front of us quite eloquently, so there's not much further that I can add. I can see both sides to this one, and as I said from the start, it was a harder one to decide on, but hoping the officer's recommendation gets up. Thank you.
Councillors, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour?
Councillor Sharp, Councillor Nation, Councillor Sypek, Councillor Byrne and Councillor Lawrence.
All those against?
Councillor Serace, Councillor Marshall, Councillor Cusack, Councillor Gauci-Marici.
Thank you, councillors. Report 9.4 on tonight's agenda is on page 102 and relates to a planning application at 62 to 64 The Parade, Ascot Vale. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Marshall.
No, excuse me, this is another long one. I would like to move that Council issue a notice of decision to refuse to grant a permit in relation to planning permit application number MV 246/2017 for the construction of 10 dwellings and a reduction in car parking requirements at number 62 to 64 The Parade, Ascot Vale, Lot 1 TP 700-251J and Lot 1 TP 692-460M in accordance with the following grounds of refusal. 1. The proposal fails to meet the overarching objective and strategies of Clause 51055, cultural identity and neighbourhood character of the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme, and would result in a development that fails to appropriately respond and contribute to neighbourhood character. 2. The proposal fails to meet the objectives and strategies contained within Clause 15031, heritage conservation, and Clause 21062, heritage of the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme, and would result in a development that is not sympathetic and does not integrate with surrounding heritage buildings. 3. The visual bulk, scale, form and layout of the proposal fails to meet the objectives and strategies of Clause 21061, neighbourhood character, and 21064, urban design, as it does not respect or contribute to the preferred character of the Garden Suburban 1 precinct, and fails to appropriately respond to its location and surrounding context. 4. The proposal fails to satisfy the following standards contained within Clause 55, 2 or more dwellings on a lot of the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme, and does not achieve an acceptable outcome in terms of the following objectives. A. Clause 55021, neighbourhood character. B. Clause 55022, residential policy. C. Clause 55031, street setback. D. Clause 55032, building height. E. Clause 55033, site coverage. F. Clause 55034, permeability. G. Clause 55038, landscaping. H. Clause 55041, side and rear setbacks. I. Clause 55046, overlooking. J. Clause 55048, noise. And K. Clause 55061, design detail. And number 5, the proposal will have an adverse effect on the residential amenity of neighbouring land.
Thank you, councillor. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Cusack. Councillor Marshall, would you like to say a few words?
I would, thank you. This is a proposal for 10 triple-storey attached dwellings, and as I mentioned with a previous application tonight, this is in a site, or this site is zoned as general residential land with all the constraints that go along with that. Again, I do acknowledge that this is for the Ascot Vale area, a large site, and it is one where there is an interface to the right-of-way at the back of the Union Road shops. So I acknowledge that, and it's only fair that we do acknowledge that. And I also acknowledge that the applicant came back with some proposed revisions to the plans following on from a consultation meeting. And certainly those revisions were better than what was proposed in the original application. But I've really reflected on this one and I've tried to work out what bothers me so much about it. And I've realised that I think it's because that, in a sense, it's got all the feel, the look, the bulk, the scale, and the amenity impacts that go along with an apartment-style dwelling, an apartment-style building, but it's tried to pretend it's not. And certainly the way that the dwellings have been sited on the land, so with the frontage towards the lane, it's meant that it has significant impacts on the surrounding properties. And I know we discussed in the consultation meeting, there are numerous other examples where you've got an interface directly with the lane or with a right-of-way that might be 3 stories. But again, because of the way this has been designed, that 3 stories sits around the whole site. And the difficulty, as I mentioned, is that it has the bulk and the scale and the impact that goes along with an apartment-style building. When you look at the preferred character statement in our neighbourhood character guidelines for this particular site, again, I'll just briefly mention a couple of points. It says that new developments will contribute to the predominant siting and finishes of the existing buildings with consistent front and side setbacks, which will ensure space for landscaping. There'll be low or permeable fences which will retain the openness of the streets. And to my mind, these are very much not achieved in the sense that this doesn't create to the openness of the street at all. It very much, again, because of the way it's located, it really almost feels shut off. It feels like it's got its back to the rest of the neighbourhood. And it's again, as I spoke about earlier, I get the same feeling with this one, that there's very much that focus around Union Road. There's that attempt to say, well, you know what, we're part of Union Road, here's a commercial zone, you've got 4 stories along there, so that's what we're part of. When the reality is that this is very much part of the parade. And you can't turn your back on the properties that sit up the street, because the reality is that this is a street which, again, very much has a heritage feel to it. There are the odd, I suppose, the six-pack type buildings that the blight of this part of Ascot Vale, all around in the Temperance Triangle and up on the hill. But there are very much lots of period style homes that are single story, and they are very valued and very loved in this area. When we look as councillors again at those red flags about what might be an overdevelopment of a site, well, there are certainly numerous red flags here. We look at obviously the site coverage, which is extremely high, and again acknowledging that there were some changes to that with the revisions. The permeability is low, and we certainly have a failure to comply with the setback requirements. And again, all of those are indicators of an application that might be an overdevelopment, and I think in this instance they very much indicators of something that is a clear overdevelopment of the site. I'm mindful too that the report references 52 to 54 Leonard's Road a number of times, and St Leonard's Road, sorry. I was going to say, given I live very close, I should know the name of that one. And sorry, I'll just make that clear, I do not live in the parade, but I live in and around this area, so know it very well. The thing with St Leonard's, that development there, is that interface with Dutton Lane. Dutton Lane is a very different lane to this right-of-way that's been proposed here, and this right-of-way can't pretend that it is Dutton Lane, because it's just not. And so I find that a not very useful comparison, because I think that the whole of the circumstances are very different, and I just don't think that they're fair comparisons at all. And the final point, sorry Mayor, that 52 seconds ticked away very quickly. One of the points I wanted to make was just in relation to the heritage elements of this, and heritage is not just about an individual property within a heritage overlay being demolished or being developed somehow. Heritage is also about the properties surrounding a site that might be developed, as again we spoke about earlier in relation to Ascot Vale Road. And there are properties within the heritage overlay on Maribyrnong Road that will be very significantly affected if this development was to proceed in the form proposed. And our obligation when we look at heritage, as I said, it's not just to prevent buildings being demolished, it is to prevent the heritage value of surrounding properties being diminished. And this, in my mind, would be very much an application which would diminish the value of the heritage overlay. So apologies for the going over a little bit, but I hope councillors see fit to support this motion to refuse this application.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cusack.
The area around the shopping strip in Union Road has been considered for some time as a possible place for more intensive development, and there's no reason why that shouldn't go ahead. The problem with this development is the 10 units or the 10 townhouses on this site. If you look just next to it, there is an almost identical site with 4 villas on it, and they sit there quite well. Now, I'm not here to compare aesthetics or anything like that, but I do look at the 2 options that we have in front of us, what was designed and developed some years ago and what is proposed now, and I can certainly see where one fits in with the neighbourhood or makes an attempt in that space and doesn't, for all of the reasons that Councillor Marshall has cited in terms of the bulk and scale and size, the overlooking, the effect on the places in Maribyrnong Road, the effect on the houses going up the hill in the parade and so on like that. It also concerns me significantly about the use of the laneway and how this laneway has now become this predominant front feature of these places, and it just doesn't work for me. The alternative proposal that was put up just recently was to, yes, do something about the setback on the east side and to take off one of the levels on the back corner of the 10th unit, the 10th house, whatever it is. But in fact, that still gives nobody any relief, really. I refer also, while people are talking about Dutton Lane here, is just very recently down at VCAT took another building, I think about number 100 or so in the parade, and rearranged that one as similar size and said, no, you don't have to have as intensive a development as they are proposing. And that's very similar in a lot of ways to what this was. And I can't see why you wouldn't have that consistency. One's on one side of Union Road, the other one's, they're like a pigeon pair to each other. The final thing that I want to really push is this question of permeability. We have an existing couple of houses. Permeability is important because obviously it's all about runoff, obviously it's all about stormwater, obviously it's all about sort of where does overflow go to. And now we're reducing what were 2 housing blocks down to just 12%. Not on. And it seems to me that there is this lack of notion that we're not sharing anything with our neighbours. This is a poor development. It's got some features that are reasonable. I don't deny. I'll finish in a second, Mayor. It's got some good features, but in my mind, it is not the working model for the parade, that environment, that amenity, and that character of the community and the neighbourhood in that space. And it overdoes it just in terms of what's on the block.
Thank you. Any other councillor? Councillor Nation.
Thank you, Mayor. I will speak in support of this refusal and join my fellow ward councillors in concurring that this application, and I note while there has been amended plans submitted back in September, does not adhere to quite a large number of elements of our planning scheme. And it's obviously something that's been referenced in multiple applications tonight. But some of the real core fundamentals, such as building height, site coverage, permeability, as outlined in Councillor Marshall's refusal, despite the amended plans being submitted, this application does still not adhere to what is set out for a general residential zone, and that is what this property, where this property is located. I won't touch on the points already raised by Councillor Cusack and Councillor Marshall, but I think this particular application is a really important test case, because Union Road's got that quite clear articulation between the commercial and the residential on the side streets. So on the north, we've got the laneway that's being discussed. On the east side, we've got the laneway that's being discussed. On the west side, we've got Dutton Lane. And while they're different, as my fellow ward councillors have noted, they do provide this really good articulation between the shops and the commercial premises on Union Road and all the residential that run off in the eastern and western directions. We have had some applications right on the cusp, such as Munro Street in our previous term of council, which we did refuse at a council level, and sadly it was overturned. But this is a really important application for us to make a stance that the commercial precinct stops where the residential precinct commences, and that is the laneway on the eastern side, it's Dutton Lane on the western side. This property is past the laneway, it is in the residential area. As Councillor Marshall correctly stated, it cannot be considered as a commercial premises. It doesn't even have the interface because it's got the laneway separating it from the commercial premises. So I think it is really important, not only for the sheer fact that it is not compliant with our planning scheme, but in terms of a precedent, to make sure that, yes, we are encouraging some development along our major arterials, but this is not on Union Road. This is on the parade. It is in a residential area, and if we approve this as a council, then there are that multitude of streets that run off in an east and west direction. Yes, I know at the time, thank you. In an east and west direction, and it will give rise to plenty of speculation that properties that are on either side of those lanes can get developed. So I really stress to, I'm just squeezing out the time, I really stress to our fellow councillors that it's really important we make a statement tonight and ensure that we retain the integrity of the residential areas in Ascot Vale.
Thank you, Councillor Nation. Any other councillor would like to say a few words? Councillor Marshall, would you like to close?
Extremely brief. Councillor Nation has just reminded me too that this is another one that, by virtue of the timing, got in before the changes to the GRZ, and that is as it is. So obviously we need to assess applications as with the rules that apply to them. But this, if we look at our neighbourhood character guidelines, this one is described as sitting within the garden suburban one. And is this the type of application you would expect to see in a garden suburban area? The answer is no, and therefore I'd ask councillors to actually support this motion to refuse.
Thank you, councillor. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Councillors, 9.5 on tonight's agenda is on page 138 and relates to a planning application at 376 Pascoe Road, Strathmore. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd just like to move a notice decision of refusal to amend.
Thank you. Would you like to read it out?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The proposed motion, the council issue a notice of decision to refuse to amend a permit in relation to the planning permit application number MV-1030-2015-A for the use and development of the land for a 5-storey building comprising a shop and dwellings, reduction to the car parking requirement, waiver of the loading bay requirement and alteration, removal of access to a road in a road zone at 376 Pascoe Vale Road, Strathmore, lots 1, 2 and 3 on TP 590642Y on the following grounds. 1, the proposed building height, scale and massing fails to meet the overarching objective and the strategies of clause 15.01-2 urban design principles of the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme and would result in an urban design outcome that fails to positively contribute to local character and enhance the public realm. 2, that the development would present a visually dominant and unsympathetic built form character to the area and will have an adverse effect on the residential amenity of the neighbouring land. 3, that the proposal fails to provide sufficient car parking as required under clause 52.06, car parking of the Moonee Valley Planning Scheme, and would exacerbate parking problems in the surrounding area. 4, the proposal will result in an adverse traffic impacts on surrounding properties and the wider area, which will be substantial and unreasonable. 5, the proposal represents an overdevelopment of the site.
Thank you, Councillor. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gouching. Councillor Lawrence, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This site already holds a planning permit for 18 dwellings and a shop with a 4-storey building limit. The permit amendment asks for an additional storey to 5 floors with an increasing to 23 dwellings and a shop. The added storey, and it might only seem like 1 storey, but it adds and creates several issues. The first thing that comes to mind is the overdevelopment of a very small parcel of land, being only 551 square metres. The visual bulk of this development being a major detraction to the local neighbourhood character. The built form and its visual impact of additional level increases the overall bulk of the development on a very small site, and as I stated, only 551 square metres. Secondly, the increase in parking of vehicles and vehicle movements and the noise impacts on all the local area and the neighbourhood is also an issue. This is a small, quiet pocket of Strathmore down the lower end towards the freeway. The other major concern is the rear lane, which will provide access into and out of the development. It is noted that the applicant is asking for a full reduction in car parking for the shop component. So the reduction there will be 4 car parking places. Also, it's noted that no visitor car parking will be provided, meaning the 4 visitor car parks that should be provided won't be there. So the likely outcome, in my opinion, we'll see cars again spilling out into the quiet residential streets and filling the streets with the overflow from this development. Other aspects to the car movement are along this tiny laneway that exists behind the Pascoe Vale towards the eastern side of the development. It ends up entering into Woodland Street. Now, the laneway is also used by local pedestrians who use it to walk through to get to Woodlands Park. And this is also a laneway that school children use from Strathmore College to access down to Woodland Street and the park itself. And this happens every day. So if we've got another abundance of cars going in and out of this development, it's going to be a major safety hazard. Now, the other aspect I'd like to raise is the waiver of the loading bay for the retail premises. And it's starting to look like this is going to be a very congested parking lot being created in a quiet pocket of Strathmore. There's no way around that. The cars, the trucks, how are they going to fill the shop, whatever it might be? Finally, the issues of overlooking and shadowing of neighbourhood properties is always, and I say always, an issue. With higher the building rises, the greater the shadowing effect and the more likely overlooking neighbouring properties is going to occur. In summary, the issues are traffic and parking impacts, pedestrian safety, particularly school children, overdevelopment on a very small site, visual bulk, off-site amenity impacts, overlooking and shadowing. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Gauci, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I will just briefly, Councillor Lawrence has spoken fairly comprehensively. I guess there's a real lesson for me particularly. This was originally determined at my first meeting as a councillor, and there was a lot of things when it came forward to us as 4 stories that we weren't happy with. We weren't happy with the border-to-border development. We weren't happy with the bulk and scale. We weren't happy with the waiver of parking. We weren't happy with the waiver of a loading zone. But at the end of the day, it was only 4 stories and it was mostly compliant, so we let it get through. We supported it. And there's a real discomfort for me now in 12 months later not having stuck to my guns about something that wasn't right 12 months ago, because now we're being asked to further push those boundaries and to further accept things that aren't compliant and to further exacerbate the parking issues. I really do feel for the residents on Wallace Crescent who get most of the parking overflow from Pascoe Vale Road developments where people choose not to go into their driveways and their parking. Because those residents on Wallace Crescent equally 12 months ago thought, you know what, it's only 4 stories, it's not that big, and now 12 months later there's very little that can be done to say, actually now it's 5 stories and it's even less compliant. So for me, I just can't bring myself to support it. I wonder what would have happened if 5 stories that wasn't compliant from a parking point of view and wasn't compliant from a loading point of view and wasn't compliant in terms of the boundary-to-boundary development. I wonder what would happen if this came to us 12 months ago and what we would have determined then. But
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillor to speak? Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't really have too much more to say. My fellow ward councillors have spoken about this application in enough detail, but I certainly concur with Councillor Lawrence and Councillor Gauci-Marici. This site is it's close to train station, and I see the report mentions that a number of times, its proximity to everything, but the 5th story I think just tips it over the edge, and I'm quite happy to support the refusal. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marshall.
just very briefly, Councillor Gauci-Marici, to address her question, if this had have come in as a 5-story application all that time ago, then I think that there is a significant chance this would have been refused at 5 stories. And I have to say, I have a real dislike of this, by stealth, in my view, attempt where someone gets a planning permit and then maybe they do their numbers and they think, well, okay, I could perhaps make this more profitable, or there might be a whole range of reasons why they then think, well, I got that, so let me just go for that bit more. The reality is probably, certainly around the parking, around a number of other issues, that the addition of that extra level will exacerbate the amenity impacts on the surrounding properties. And I think that this is a situation where the applicant should have been thinking, all right, I got my 4 stories, that is as it is, I will build my 4 stories, rather than coming in a relatively short period of time later and saying, give me more.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillor? Councillor Cusack.
I'm just going to absolutely echo what Councillor Marshall said. If this had been a 5-story development, I don't think I would have been standing for it at the time. We actually, and as Councillor Gauci-Marici has said, and Councillor Lawrence in his opening remarks, there was a lot of given in this development in the first place. There were things that were concerns about it in the first place, but we went ahead and approved it. Now, I'm not sure that it's actually a type of development to go 5 stories and look at that area, as Councillor Lawrence says, that although it's near the railway station, are we talking about an intensive development that will be ongoing, not just this one, but a whole lot of other ones in that area, that will all of a sudden start reaching for the skies. I think the 5-storey proposal is not well conceived. It doesn't add anything to the development, and it doesn't add anything to that neighbourhood.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillor? Councillor Lawrence, would you like to close?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I appreciate the comments from my fellow councillors and support from particularly the ward councillors in the support for the refusal. I think we have to be careful that we don't put out a message to our development community, applicants and so forth, that you can just come back to council with a further development to enhance and increase the value of your investment in whatever development you might be looking at. And I think there's a real danger in that to this council, and I think we're all smart enough and adult enough to realise when that comes along and when it is something that we want to nip in the bud as quickly as we can, and to just accept what comes along is not the nature of this council, from what I can gather, and I'm pleased to hear that and pleased to see it. So I would certainly encourage all councillors to support this with their vote. Thank you.
Councillors, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. 9.6 on tonight's agenda is on page 153 and relates to a planning application at 33 to 35 Raleigh Street, Essendon. Councillors, do I have a mover? Councillor Sharp.
I'd like to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Do I have a Councillor Gauci? Councillor Sharp, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, Mayor. Look, this site, I'm sure everybody around this table has a sentimental attachment to 33 to 35 Raleigh Street, Essendon, particularly those of us that have lived here for a long time. It's the site of Roslyn Court, which has been a very, very successful reception venue over the past lots and lots of years. I went there for my Year 12 dinner, had lots of family weddings there, and I could go on. It's certainly been a very popular venue for the wider community of Moonee Valley too, I believe. So basically this application is seeking to demolish the buildings that are on site now and build a residential aged care facility. So considering the site is 5,031 square metres, which is a very, very large site, certainly within that purely residential pocket of Essendon, I'm quite happy to support the construction of an aged care facility. I think these types of services are certainly lacking within our municipality, and being, you know, I'm sure it's going to be modern built and all the rest of it. So I would certainly, look forward to seeing how this all plays out with regards to this application. But I'm pretty passionate about heritage buildings in the area, and this has always been under a heritage overlay, although just recently the heritage overlay was removed because it was determined that although it looks very, very old, the main core of all the buildings there aren't actually significantly heritage. I visited the site a while ago now and had a good look around. There was one wall to the west side, I think it was, that was the only surviving wall effectively from when it was built in the 1800s. Everything else had been redone perfectly, so it looked authentic, and it looked certainly, it looked and felt heritage, like a heritage building. So they certainly did a fantastic job. But that's also why it's been so popular as a venue, and why so many people are actually attached to it. But the fact is that the venue has closed, and now we have this in front of us. I think we should be celebrating the fact that we are going to have an up-to-date and modern aged care facility right here in the heart of Essendon. And although I'm sad to see it go, it's a very, very, very positive outcome on a very, very large site. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Gauci.
I think I will echo many of the sentiments of Councillor Sharp. My grandparents got married there, my aunts and uncles got married there, I nearly got married there. I've had cousins who worked there, and I have been to more functions than I could possibly endeavour to count at Roslyn Court. There is certainly a huge part of me that is tinged with sadness because of that. But part of me then reads the report and was really disappointed to learn that the heritage wasn't really heritage. I would quote that the heritage place has changed beyond recognition of its original architecture, character, and no longer holds the attributes which made it significant. So they obviously did a fantastic job fudging old age. There's another part of me that thinks about what this could have been, and I think about the scale and density of townhouses or apartments that we could have ended up with on this site. So there is part of me that is jumping for joy at what has been offered to us. It certainly responds to some of the questions that we ask as part of Moonee Valley 2040 about how we accommodate the future communities and the ageing community in our municipality. Certainly we have, in the 12 months that I've been on council, been made aware on so many occasions now of the importance of enabling our community to age in place and the significant gaps in the market for that to be able to happen. So I'm really, really pleased to see that this is what's been proposed. I was also really pleased to see that the development's designed to comply with the Garden's suburban character, and the many of the conditions, well, there aren't many conditions compared to a lot of the other applications earlier, but the conditions which have been applied do further support this. So things around the brickwork at the front are a really nice way to protect some of the character in the area, but certainly very, very happy to support this. So,
Councillor, any other councillor that say a few words? Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is a magnificent site, and it's right in the heart of Essendon, and I did not get married there, by the way, and it's an area that screams out for residential aged care. Residential aged care and the like. Generally, they have to leave Essendon to find that facility if you're in that age bracket. Be that Avondale Heights, Taylors Lakes, Keilor, wherever. But now we're going to have a residential aged care right in the heart of Essendon for Essendon people, hopefully. And that's fantastic. That will be a real bonus because people like, particularly the aged, and we're all heading down that path eventually, are comfortable in the area they're living in and staying in. So I think it's a great move. We're sorry to see the end of the facility that was there before, and I've been there many times myself and enjoyed the facility, but they're like Eden Hope and other ones that used to exist in the city of Moonee Valley, they don't anymore, and we have to move forward. But at least this is a great outcome for the local residents, and we have an old population within Essendon that will need this facility, so fantastic.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillor? I'd just like to make a few comments as well. I've known for a very long time that the only parts of this property that were heritage was one wall and two ceiling roses, that's it. And everything else was just magnificently done, and I understand the sentiment with this property, so yeah. Councillor Sharp, or Councillor Marshall, did you want to say a few words?
I only wanted to add my my comments in support, in the sense that that real gap in relation to aged care that exists in Essendon is going to be filled by this, and I think that's a real positive. It's certainly preferable, I think, to the previous planning permit in relation to this site that was approved. And I kind of think there might be something nice if you were someone who did get married there, and you know what, you think if you lived out your last days on a site that had a lot of sentimental value to you too, that would be quite special. So I'm happy to support the motion.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cusack.
Well, there's nothing that starts to spark the notion of heritage when people go nostalgia, and sometimes it's difficult to separate the two. And I obviously everybody who's spoken around this development and have noted that its significant place in the life of Essendon people. Not that I'd know, because I was brought up in the Olympic Village, so we didn't have any buildings like this down there. But anyway, but on the other side of that, I note that the Heritage Advisor has sought to get an archival record going, a photographic, archival record, and that will be preserved within the Essendon Historical Society. And so the context of how life has moved and changed within the city of Moonee Valley from its earliest days, when this place was entirely relevant. But from a business point of view, it's interesting to see, and just as Councillor Lawrence has mentioned, the demise of Edenhope, and I know that there are other places of the same sort, reception centres of the same sort, have the same struggles, and it's not just in this neck of the woods, but it's across Melbourne. And so people are looking for a different way to celebrate those moments in their lives, and that's fine. And I think that the development, one thing that strikes me very much about this development as an aged care facility is the amount of green space that has been put into this, and the consideration of how people on this new development will be able to access green space, or at least see it very readily, and you don't have it tucked away somewhere around in the South 40 down in the far end of the place, and in fact is very much where you live. And so I can only commend this development, and I'll support it.
Thank you. Councillor Sharp, would you like to close?
No, I don't think I need to add anything further. Thank you.
I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. 9.7 on tonight's agenda is on page 179. It's entitled Strathmore Community Garden Lease Renewal. Councillors, do I have a mover? Councillor Gauci. Move the officers. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Cusack. Councillor Gauci.
Albeit briefly, just to say that I have spent a bit of time down at the community garden in Strathmore, and they do some fantastic work there, and there is a really lovely community down there, so I am pleased to see that we can support them for a further term.
Thank you. Councillor Cusack.
And just quickly to support Councillor Gauci-Marucci's motion, supporting this supports Council's policy in so many other ways, whether it's about our greening policy, whether it's about our urban forests, whether it's about our capacity to provide a community that is connected and has well-being and health. So there's no logic in not supporting it, I would have thought.
Any other councillor? Councillor Gauci, would you like to close? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. 9.8 on tonight's agenda is on page 183 and is entitled Councillors' Appointment to External Bodies and Other Communities. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Gauci.
I'd like to move the officer's recommendation, but just with there's a couple of positions that haven't been noted as subs that are subs.
Read them out?
Yes, if I could please. So, as is written at point G, Councillor Sharp and then Councillor Sypek for sub. Councillor Haight, sorry. It's been a long day. Item Haight, Councillor Sypek with Councillor Lawrence as sub. Item I, Councillor Byrne with Councillor Sarace as sub. Item M, Councillor Nation with Councillor Gauci-Marucci as sub. I think that's all of them. That's all of them.
And the rest as...
And the rest as written.
Okay, do I have a seconder? Councillor Sharp.
Could I please... I just need to ask if we could add something extra. Do I do it now, or do I do it?
Yeah, we'll do it now.
Mover, Councillor Gauci-Marucci. Could you please also add the Essendon Airport Community Aviation Group No, that's not one. Hang on. Essendon Airport Community Aviation Consultation Group, CACG. It's not up there in our list.
For the purposes of the motion, if we put Essendon Airport CACG / Essendon Fields Council Group,
It's two totally separate.
That's all right. If you can add,
Totally separate groups. It's, CACG have a separate terms of reference that are endorsed through Essendon Airport.
item P then.
Item P.
And I've been the rep for that, but happy to have both ward councillors as sub.
Okay, that's fine. So the move.
Essendon Airport Community Aviation Consultation Group. Thank you.
Councillor Goucher, are you happy with that amendment?
I am, but I'm not sure that a seconder had seconded it to
No,
second
it's-
the amendment.
So do I call for a seconder to this amendment? Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Goucher, would you like to speak to the item?
I think it is fairly procedural. There are lots and lots of committees that we all get to sit on, and everyone gets to attend lots and lots of meetings and do lots of good work.
Councillor Lawrence.
No, I've got nothing further to add, Mr Mayor.
Would any other councillor like to say a few words? Councillor Goucher, would you like to close?
I think we're right.
I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour?
Sorry.
Sorry. Oh no. She's just adding it now. Sorry, Mr Mayor.
Sure.
It wasn't finished up there.
Oh, okay.
Totally.
Oh,
Is what we discussed.
Now it's finished.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll
Sorry,
put
thank
that
you.
to the vote. All those in favour? Could you read them out?
Councillor Sharp, Councillor Nation, Councillor Marshall, Mr Mayor, Councillor Byrne, Councillor Cusack, Councillor Gauci-Marici, Councillor Lawrence,
All those against?
Councillor Serace.
Thank you. Notices of motion. Councillors, the next item of business is notice of motion, and we have no notices of motion listed tonight. We'll go to the next item. Urgent business. The next item is of urgent business. And councillors, do we have any items of urgent business? No? Confidential reports. The next item of business is confidential reports, and councillors, we have one confidential report this evening. So councillors, do I have a motion that the meeting goes into camera to consider a matter which contains information relating to other matters? Councillor Byrne? Second, Councillor Cusack? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. We'll take a 5-minute break. What do you reckon, guys?